Hey everyone, how are you doing? And welcome back to part 2 of Become a Pro at PivotTable course. In the last video, we made some pivot tables. Let me just, oh my god, what happened to my voice? Now, okay. Let me just go back to the pivot table 1 that we created in the last part. What we did here was we actually dropped the department in the rows. Sorry, we dropped the department in the columns, and we dropped the regions down here to rows, and we got this pivot table ready. So before we kind of move ahead and delve down deeper into features of pivot table, I just want to take you through what is there in the pivot table features that are available to you. So let me just quickly empty this pivot table up. So I'm just going to take off the departments, check this out. Okay, and my pivot table is clear. As soon as you create a pivot table from your data, from this data, and the shortcut for that was Alt-NV, and you put up in a new worksheet, two things appear in the first go. The first thing that appears is the pivot table itself. Now this is the place where the pivot table is going to be created. And the second thing that appears is the pivot table field list. So you can think of this box as a pivot table creator. So this box is going to have all the headers of your data. So I think there are about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And if I just flip over to my data, I would also have the 7 headers right here. You can actually also have a couple of more fields that you can create it yourself right in the pivot table itself. We'll talk about that later. But as of now, by default, it will pull up all the headers from your data and put it up right in this box. You can think of this box as a pivot table creator. This is also known as pivot table field list, right? And this is your pivot table where the pivot table is actually going to be created. Okay, so this was about this, and I'm just going to quickly get back to having the same pivot table. So the departments were in the columns right here, and the region was in the rows right here. Okay, and the CTC was in the value. So we get the total of the CTCs. Okay, before we actually move on with more options in pivot tables, I'd quickly like to cover something that I left in the part 1 video, which I did not cover, was the thing that what would happen to your pivot table in case your data changes at the back. So I'm just going to flip over to the data, right? And what I'm going to do is I am going to change some numbers right here, and let's see if our pivot table changes or not. Okay, so let's just pick up some guy here. Let's just pick up Young, and let's make Young Lucky. So I'm just going to increase his CTC by, let's say, some couple of $1,000. So let's just make it 111, and let's see. So if you just take a look at Young, which works in the western region, the total of the west is now 130 million. If I just flip over to my pivot table, and if I just take a total of the west, it is still about 18.98 million, which brings us to the fact that pivot tables do not update the data automatically. Now I'd like to give you a good reason that why do pivot tables do not do it automatically, and why does a formula actually update the data automatically. So I'm just going to go to the data and flip over to this formula. Now what happens is that when you actually write a formula in Excel, the formula is attached to the data, and then as soon as the data is changing, the formula quickly updates the value. That's one of also the additional advantages of using a formula. But what happens in a pivot table is that when you're creating a pivot table, and let's say I'm just creating a pivot table, so I would go to the insert pivot table, and it picks up this range. So now this entire data gets into the pivot table, and it would, after it gets feeded inside the pivot table, it would break the active link with the pivot table, and the entire data set gets stored in something called as pivot table cache. Now that my data is stored in the pivot table cache, and which has also broken the link with my active data set, how do I make sure that my pivot table actually refreshes? So what I have to do is I have to refresh the pivot table manually. So I'm just going to give you 2 or 3 ways to do it. You can pick it up, whatever works best for you. So you can actually go in the Analyze tab and you can click on Refresh Pivot Table right here, Refresh. It also has a shortcut attached to it, which is Alt F5. So I'm just going to click on Refresh, and instantly this value updates here, right? So you can also use an Alt F5 total. So I'm just going to go back to my data and just going to change it back. So we'll just make this guy unlucky once again. And I'm just going to go back to my pivot table, and this time I'm going to use a shortcut which is Alt F5 to refresh my pivot table. Alright, just in case if you have multiple pivot tables, so you have one pivot table and you have another pivot table and you have another pivot table, and you want to refresh all the pivot tables together, you can use the shortcut Control Alt F5. So Alt F5 is the shortcut to refresh a single pivot table. So refresh a single pivot table, and Control Alt F5 will refresh multiple pivot tables. So multiple pivot tables. Right, so that was about refreshing the pivot tables with shortcuts. I'm going to teach you how to refresh a pivot table by writing a short macro. What I'm going to do is flip over to the developer tab here, right here. You may not have worked with the developer tab before, but not to worry. We're going to make you activate the developer tab in a quick moment. If you do not find this developer tab, my instructions are for you now. So you have to go in the File menu. My instructions are for people who are working with Excel 2013 or Excel 2010. So File menu, and then go on to the options here, options, Excel options here, right here, and then you have to go to the customized ribbon and check on the developer tab. I repeat, my instructions are for people who are working on Excel 2013 or Excel 2010. This is the way you can activate the developer tab into your computer. Now my instructions are for people who are working with Excel 2007. So in Excel 2007, right on the top here, instead of the File menu, you would have the round Microsoft button. So why don't you click on that button, and when you click on that button, somewhere on the right hand side here you would find Excel options. So a similar window is going to appear, Excel options, once you click on that option. Right now my tab is a general tab. In your screen you would find something called as popular tab, right? So click on the popular tab. You would find the third option which says that show developer tab, something like that, show developer tab. Our versions are different, so mine is general and the third option is different here. But if you're working on Excel 2007, you would have a popular tab here, and the third option is going to be show developer tab, and you just tick that and you press OK, and you would have the developer tab in your computers. Okay, so moving on. So developer tab, and then I'm going to go to the Visual Basic, VB Visual Basic. Okay, so we are in the VBA window, and don't worry about it, even if you don't know VBA too much, or if this is the first time you're writing a macro, so it's not going to be much of a trouble. So we're just going to make it real quick and real short and also real simple. On the left hand side, I have the file name, which is part 2. This is what we're working on as of now. And what you can do is make sure that you insert a module in the part 2, right? So part 2, I have inserted a module here, and I'm going to start writing a macro here. So let's say we name the macro as sub refresh my pivot, right? That's the name of the macro. So sub is how you start the macro, and end sub is how you end the macro, and this is some name that you've given to your macro. It doesn't really matter much, so make sure there are no spaces in the names. That's about it. I'm just going to write one line of macro, and that's about it. So I'm going to write, in the active sheet I will find some pivot tables, so dot pivot tables, and the name of the pivot table that I'm currently working on is, let me just click here. This is the pivot table that I'm working on, and I want to write a macro to refresh it automatically. So I'm going to click here on the pivot table and find out what is the name of this pivot table. So click here and you would go to the Analyze tab, and you would find the name of the pivot table is PivotTable 2. So I'm going to copy the name from here, Control C, and flip over to the macro. Okay, and I'm going to write in inverted commas the name of the pivot table. Now I'm going to say that active sheet, in the active sheet, PivotTables, PivotTable 2, this is the pivot table that I'm referring to. I want to refresh the pivot table, so I want to say that pivot cache dot refresh. That's about it. So we are saying that the pivot cache where the data is stored, can you please refresh that? And for which pivot table? Pivot table 2 in the active sheet. That's about it. One line macro. So even if you don't know how to write the macro, just copy it, give the correct pivot table name, find it out from the Analyze tab, and you're good to go. Please remember that this macro is only going to refresh the pivot table 2, not all the pivot tables that you have created. And I'm going to let you know that quickly how can you do that in a while. So that's my macro. I'm just going to minimize this, and I'm back to my sheet. Now what I could do is I could quickly go to the go to the data, and I'm just going to again make this guy lucky. Wow, what luck he has. Too much money, huh? Okay, anyways, so we've refreshed his salary. Now let's go back to our data, pivot 1. We're going to now run the macro. Okay, so we go in the developer tab and we go to the macros and we run this macro. Click here and run, and just like that our number gets refreshed. This is one way. In the forthcoming sessions we're going to learn simpler ways of running the macro as well. We'll link it to some button or things like that, so we'll be a little more creative when we go to more advanced sessions in this course. So as of now we have just refreshed our pivot table. Let's just quickly write a macro to refresh all the pivot tables in our data. So I'm going to flip over to the my VBA window, and I'm going to write a new macro. So sub refresh all pivot tables. Oh, what happened? Pivot tables. Refresh all pivot tables. I think there's a spelling mistake. Refresh all pivot tables. Anyways, that's fine. Let's move on. So I'm going to say very simple. In the active workbook, I will say refresh all. Everything gets refreshed. That's about it. So this is your macro for refreshing everything inside your pivot table, and this is your macro for refreshing only pivot table number 2. So don't worry about it. Even if you don't know how to write a macro, you can just copy and paste these macros and you can enjoy refreshing the pivot tables automatically. Alternatively, you already know about the shortcuts Alt F5 for refreshing a single pivot table, and Control Alt F5 for refreshing multiple pivot tables. And now let's move on to doing some real-time calculations in our pivot tables. We're going to now look at a couple of pivot table tabs that are available to you when you actually create a pivot table. So this is my pivot table that I created, and as soon as I click on the pivot table, 2 new tabs appear that we have clicked and worked inside a couple of times now. But let's just take a look at in detail what is inside them and how do you work with them. These are the 2 tabs that only appear when you actually click on a pivot table. So if I click outside the pivot table, these tabs disappear. So there are no more tabs here. So when you actually click on the pivot table, these tabs appear. Also, the field list appears only when you work inside the pivot table. So if any cell is selected, this field list, which is your pivot table creator, appears, and the pivot table sensitive tabs also appear at that time. So I'm going to click inside a pivot table so that I can see my tabs, and I'm going to go inside the Analyze tab, and let's see what is inside the Analyze tab. Well, just in case you are working in Excel 2007 or in Excel 2010, instead of an Analyze tab, what you would find is the Options tab that is available to you. More or less, the options available to you, or the tools available to you inside the Analyze tab and the Options tab, which is in Excel 7 or in Excel 10, more or less the options are the same. So let's just take a look. So on the left hand side, what you have is a pivot table name, which we just saw when we were copying the name in the macro, and underneath that you have the pivot table options. So when you click on the options tab, this will give you a dialog box to work around with the pivot table. So you have different options here: the layout options, the filter options, which you can actually turn on and turn off the grand totals, the display options, and the printing options, the data options, the text options, and a whole lot of things like that. In the layout options, there's one thing that is interesting, and I'd like to draw your attention towards that, which is that it automatically auto-fits the column width on update. So if you just want to kind of not change the width of the cells, the columns, when the pivot table gets updated, you can just uncheck that and it will not do it again and again. It's kind of irritating sometimes. Just close it down here. I'm not doing that as of now. And let's just move to the Analyze tab once again. And the next thing is active field and sum of CTC. This is actually the name of your calculation that you have just done in the pivot table. You can change that too. Make sure that the name that you're keeping is not similar to any of the field lists in your pivot table, right? Then you have something called as field settings, which is like a one-stop shop for all the calculations that you would want to do. As of now, I am doing the sum for the CTC in my pivot table. I could also choose to do the count or the average or the max or the min or the product and a whole lot of things that I could do. I'm going to cover this in much detail in the next video, but as of now, let's just go on. Moving on, again, Analyze tab. Then you would have two options like an insert slicer and insert timeline. Insert slicer, insert timelines are the two new entrants in Excel 2013. Although you had insert slicer in 2010, but they also added another feature called insert timeline in Excel 2013. You would not find either of the two in Excel 2007. Sorry about that, can't really help much. We're going to check out these features. These are really cool features. We're going to check it out once we actually move on to the other parts of the video. Moving on, this is what we have checked out: the refresh tab, the change data source. This is where you can change the data source. Some more options here for clear, for select, and move the pivot table into a new sheet or anything like that. Field items and sets. Now if you just take a look at all the pivot table items, the fields that are available to you, these fields are actually the same as the headers in my data. So this is my data. These headers have actually gone and sat inside the pivot table. So what I was saying was, in field items and sets, I have the ability to add more customized fields that are not there in my data. We'll talk about that in detail, but this is the place where we would go and we would add more customized fields in the pivot table that I do not have in my data. Then you can actually create a pivot chart, some recommended pivot tables. So if you can just click on the recommended pivot tables, it's going to show you that what analysis that you could probably do from your data. So this is one thing that you could think of doing. I don't usually use this too much. Again, in the Analyze tab, these three buttons might just create some curiosity to you, and I'm just going to explain that once again. So let's say I'm just trying to change the pivot table a bit. What I would like to add in my pivot table is that I'd like to move the departments underneath the regions, so that I have East and all the departments here, I have North and I have all the departments here, and I have South and I have all the departments here. Now if you just take a look, these are little minus and plus minus buttons here that are just helping me collapse or expand the data, right? So if you just go in the Analyze tab, just in case you want to see these minus or plus minus buttons, you can actually check this and uncheck this, and it will help you see those buttons and just turn them off or turn them on in case you want to see that or not. But I think it's a good way to collapse or expand the data. They don't look too bad as well, so I let them stay. And then this is the option to turn off or turn on your field list. Field list is nothing but your pivot table creator. So if you want to turn this off, you can just go to the Analyze tab and uncheck this. Just click here and this will go off. Now, although you're working inside the pivot table, but still you would not be able to see the pivot table creator or your pivot table field list. One of the alternative ways to turn that on is just right click on the pivot table and you can say that you want to see the pivot table field list and it comes back. Alternatively, you can also go to the Analyze tab and you can bring it back from here. Alright, so the last one was field headers. So if you just click here, it is going to turn off the headers here, right? Let me just switch back to the normal pivot table that we already created. So you see that row and column headers have gone, so field headers. Alright, like I was saying that you have two tabs available, the Analyze tab and the Design tab. In the Analyze tab, you would find everything technical about pivot table. All the options which are more technical in nature, you would find it in the Analyze tab. All the features of the pivot table which are more formatting oriented in nature, you would find it in the Design tab. So let's just go check out the Design tab now. So in the Design tab, you have a whole lot of options to format the pivot table in case you're a formatting freak and you really love to format the data a bit, so you can pick up any other format, or you can even customize your own style, give it a name, and you can actually customize the way your pivot table looks. These are really I don't know, they look scary to me anyways. So you can pick your own style, you can also create your own pivot table style, and you can actually do a lot of coloring and all that stuff here. Alright, then these features are about row headers, column headers, just in case you want to see them. Banded rows, they are going to color the alternative rows. Banded columns are going to color the alternative columns, and I think they just make the pivot table look a lot more dirtier. So I don't use them. So just in case you're planning to insert any blank rows in the pivot table, you can use this option. Then we move on to report layout. The report layout option actually gives you 4 or 5 different ways to show your report. So as of now, we have the default one selected, or we can actually go and show the report in the tabular form. The tabular form actually brings the name of the field into the pivot table. So we have selected region and we have selected the department, and it actually writes those things right in the pivot table. So that's the benefit of having the tabular option. Showing the grand totals or showing or not showing the grand totals, you can check out these options. So a whole lot of options here available in the pivot tables. Design tab, please remember, is for the formatting of the pivot table. You would find most of the options here, and the Analyze tab would contain a lot of analysis and technical based options that are available to you. Also, a lot of these options you would find it in the right click of the pivot table menu, which we're going to discuss it as we move along the way. Now that we are done with the Analyze and the Design tab in the pivot tables, we are now going to cover one of the awesome features of the pivot tables known as grouping the dates, for which I'm going to put up a case. Let's say, for example, we have to find out how many people joined the company year on year and quarter on quarter. I'm just going to flip over to my data and create a new pivot table for that. So Alt NV enter, and I'm going to put it up in the new worksheet. Right, so I have a new pivot table here, and I'm going to now create that pivot table where I have to find out how many people joined the company year on year and quarter on quarter. I'm just going to write that question down here. So how many people join the company year on year and quarter on quarter. Okay, so we have this question right here. Let's just change the font a bit. I like this font. Alright, so this is my question that I want to now do it. So now I'm in the pivot table and I'm just going to do this. So as I said before we set on to do the pivot table, I just like to quickly do a pre-work on the pivot table and visualize the end result first. So my years are going to come like this. So my years are going to be like this. So years, and I will have all the years here. So let's say 1900 and 1901 and so on and so forth. Right, and I will have all my quarters here. So from quarter 1, quarter 2, quarter 3, and quarter 4. And I will have here how many number of people joined the company. Right. So this is the kind of format that I want. for which I have to drag the years in the rows and the quarters in the columns. Let's just get moving. So here's my pivot table fields. I'll bring it closer right here, and now I'm going to drag the years in the rows, but I see that there are no years here. So let me just drag the only thing that I have, which is the date of joining. So I'm just going to drag the date here to the rows, right? I get the dates here, and now I'm going to drag the number of employees to the values field. So I'm just going to drag this to this, right? So since name of the employee is a text thing, it's going to, as soon as you drag that in the values section, it is automatically going to give you the count of that field. So, but we're not interested in finding out that how many employees joined on that particular date. I want to group these dates into years. So what I'm going to do is right click on the dates, and I'm just going to go over to the group option, right click group, and I will say that I want this date into years and quarters. That's what I want, years and quarters, and I will click OK, and I have that years and quarters. Now how did I want that? I wanted the date to be, I wanted the years to be in the rows and the quarters to be in the columns, and I'm just going to do that, right? So put the DOJ here, date of joining, you have the quarters right here, and you have the dates right here. I'm just going to do a bit of formatting with a pivot table. So I don't want to see the grand totals. I'm going to move over to the design tab, and in the grand totals I will turn off the grand totals for the rows and for the columns right here, right? So grand totals are off. Now I also want to see instead of row labels and column labels, I want to see the field name. And what is it? This is years and this is quarters. This is what I want to see. So I am going to go to the design tab once again, and report layout I will choose to show in the tabular form, and I got that right. So that is my pivot table. Now at times you know, the dates and the quarters can trick you with a more customized question. So let's say in India we have our financial year starting from April, right? So we would, this quarter is not really quarter one for us. Let's just see that what months are covered under this quarter. So I'm going to right click on this and go on to dates again, and I will also choose to have months, right? And as soon as I have the months with me, I will drop the years back in here. So if you see that quarter one is made up of Jan, Feb and March. This is not what we follow in India. We follow our first quarter from April, May and June, right? And now we want to fix this problem in our pivot table. So how do we do that? A bit of calculations to set that up. Let's just go over to a new worksheet, and let's just try and see that how can we find a quarter for any date, right? So I'm just going to take this off, and this is again Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4, and I'm going to insert a new sheet. And what was that? Oh, that's a separate pivot table. I'm just going to delete that. I don't know why that was created in the first place. So pivot to, alright. Now I'm going to insert a new sheet, and I will rename this as Indian quarter problem. Alright, now focus here. So let's say, for example, we have a couple of dates. I'm just doing in rough first, and then I will incorporate that into my pivot table. So let's say we have dates, and we have to find the year of these dates and the quarter of these dates, the correct quarter of these dates, and to be more specific, the Indian quarter of these dates, right? So I'm just going to do that. The shortcut that I use to change the column width is Alt-OCW, and I will set it up to 12. Right? Alright, so let me just create a set of dummy dates. So for which I'm going to use the rand between function, equals to rand between. The lower value is, let's say 35,000, and the upper value is, let's say 40,000, and I will press Control Enter and convert these numbers to dates. Remember, dates are nothing but numbers in Excel, and I'm going to do a value based on these dates, right? Alright, so now these are my dates. Now if you just take a look at this date, originally the 11th of January is going to fall in the first quarter in the calendar year, but in the Indian fiscal year it is falling in the fourth quarter. So how do I fix this up? So let me just quickly do the month names here. So I'm going to say January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, and December. Right, so this is my months. And if I were to work on the standard calendar, so then my calendar would pick up the first 3 months as first quarter, the next 3 months as the second quarter, and then the third quarter, and then the fourth quarter, right? On the contrary, if this would have been an Indian calendar or Indian fiscal year calendar, Indian quarter, this would have been the fourth quarter. So fourth quarter, this would have been the fourth quarter. This would have been the first quarter, because April, May, June is the first quarter, and then the second quarter, and then the third quarter, and this is how we go, right? So we want the first quarter here, we want the second quarter here, and so on and so forth, right? So I'm going to pick up any date. So let's just pick up why don't we pick up 11th of January and just try and make it as a fourth quarter, right? So I'm going to pick up 11th Jan 2000. The year could be any year as of now, so I'm just writing any year. So 11th Jan 2000, that's the date, and we want to make sure that we get the fourth quarter instead of the first quarter, right? So let's see how do we do that. So the first thing that I'm going to do is move the date back to 3 months, because so edate and moving the date back to 3 months, we're going to use -3, because we want to push the date to 3 months before, and that is going to give the date in the last quarter. That means if I'm standing on this quarter, what would have been the date in the last quarter? In the last quarter, the date would have been the 11th of October 1999. So push the date to the last quarter, right? So this is the first thing that we're going to do. Just creating more space here, and then the next thing that we're going to do is find out what month is that. So find out what month is that date, right? So what month is this date? Equals to month function, month of this date, right? So this is the 10th month, right? October was the 10th month, right? In the last quarter, I said October, fourth quarter, 10th month, right? Now what we want to do is we want to convert this into factors of 3, right? So what I want to do is that my months could be from 1 to 12, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, right? This could be my months, right? It could be any month, right? Now if I get the month as 1, 2, 3, I would like to get 3 as a result, right? If my months are 4, 5, 6, I would like to get 6 as a result. So I'm pushing the month number to a factor of 3, right? So that's what I want to do. So here I would like to get 9, and then I would like to get 12, right? Right? So this is what I want to do. So pushing the month to a factor of 3, right? So how do I do that? So I'm just going to insert a column here. So pushing factor of 3, let me just write factor of 3, right? How do I do that? So I'm going to say equals to ceiling of this date, and I want to push it to the significance of 3, the factor of 3, right? So now if this is 10, it's going to give me what? 12, right? And now I can simply divide this 12 with 3 to get the quarter, right? So how do I get the quarter? Quarter, this date divided by 3 is going to give me the quarter, right? So now I can change any date here. So let's say I pick up March, so let's say 1st of March, sorry, I pick up 1st March 2009, and 1st March 2009 is going to be the fourth quarter, right? March, as per Indian quarter, is going to be the fourth quarter, and that's what we get. Let's pick up any other day, then let's try and find it out. Let's take April. So 23rd. Well, let's pick up today's date. 27th April. That's my birthday. Why do I forget? So let's say I was born in 1986, 27th April 1986. That's the first quarter then, right? April. In the normal calendar, second quarter. In the Indian calendar, first quarter. That's what we wanted to do. So this one consolidated formula is going to be, so I'm just going to write all of this into one formula. So I'm first going to push this date by 3 months back, so minus 3 months. Alright, so this is going to give me the previous 3 months date. Now then I'm going to find out the month of this date. Then I'm going to push this date by a ceiling of 3, right? So this is going to push the date by a factor of 3, push the month by a factor of 3, and I'm simply going to divide that by 3, and I will get the quarter. That's what we are getting, right? So we're going to do this here. So what do? I just copy this formula, Control C, Control V, and I link the right cell. Oops, I just linked the right cell, right? And I'm just going to get the quarter, Control D for dragging it down. I use a lot of shortcuts. Now that we have the quarter number, we are going to find out that which year is it, right? So in the Indian fiscal year, how do we do that? So let's say from 1st of April, let's say 2015 till the 31st of March 2016. So this is financial year 16, FY16, right? So all the months in the financial year 15 will also fall under financial year 16. So we actually want 2016 from months starting April, May, June, July. So from all these months, we want the next year, right? So I'm just going to write a quick formula. If the month of this date, right? So this is going to get the month of this date, right? We just saw that. If the month of this date is less than or equal to 3, that means it's January, February, or March, then what do you want? You want just the year to be calculated of this date. Otherwise, you want to push the year of this date by 1, right? I'm going to close the bracket and I hope it works. Yes, it works, right? So since it's August, it's going to fall in the next financial year, so I get my dates, and I'm going to drag it down and I have all the years here, right? So this is how we're going to tackle the Indian financial year problem. Now I'm going to build this calculation in my data set. So over to my data, and where is it? Here. So I'm going to say Alt-IC for inserting the column, one more column for the year and one more column for the date. So this is my year, let's call that financial year, and this is, let's say, financial quarter, QTR, right? So how do we do the quarter thing? So now very simple, we are doing it for the 3rd time, and you gotta help me with that. So EO month, first thing, E date, first thing, start date, pushing it back by 3 months, we get the previous date, right? Previous 3 months, previous date, and then we would find the month of this date, and then we would push the month by a ceiling of 3, and then divide that by 3 to find the quarter. So I'm just going to convert that into number formatting, and we have this, right? So what is it? May is the 1st quarter, July is the 2nd quarter, August the 2nd quarter. Yes, we are correct. Now the year thing. So again, so if the month of this date is less than equal to 3, then I want the year, I just got to close the bracket here, then I want to find the year of this date. Otherwise, I want to find the year of this date and add 1 to it. because that is going to push over the date to the next financial year, right? So, and I'm just going to convert that into the number format and I get the years, right? Now I'm going to go back to my pivot table 2 where I had this thing. Now I'm going to refresh the pivot table to pick up the data once again. So pivot table 2, Alt F5 to refresh the pivot table, sorry, Alt F5, and we have the two new things added, right? So I'm going to take off the quarters and the years that we have created for, this is the calendar quarters, calendar years, and now I'm going to drop the financial year and financial quarter right here. So, but they have got dropped in the wrong column since they're values. So this is going to go here and this is going to go here, and just like that we have the years and we have the quarters calculation ready. So this is more customized Indian financial year, Indian financial quarter calculation. Okay, moving on. Alright, now let's say we want to analyze that between different salary brackets how many people fall. So we want to do kind of a salary distribution analysis, and for which we need to create a frequency table of the salary. Let's see how do we do that. Okay, so I am going to go to my data and create a new pivot table. So Alt NV enter, putting up on the new pivot new sheet and calling this as pivot 3. Okay, now I have to drop the salary into the rows. Okay, so just as the way that I've told you, we're going to do a bit of pivot table pre-work first. So what do I want? So I want my salary frequency to be here. So salary distribution. God, I forgot the spelling. Right. So let's say salary between $50,000 to $100,000 here, from $101,000 to let's say $150,000 right here. Pardon me if there are more zeros or something. This is just a demo. Don't take that too seriously. Okay. Anyways, yeah, we're going to have the distributions here, and we're going to find out that how many people fall between this distribution right here. So people falling in this range, and we want a count for that. So we want to have the count for people, right? This is what we want, right? So I'm just going to take it off, and I'm now going to draw the pivot table so that I know exactly what field items to drop where. So now, alright, so where's my CDC? Where's my salary? Here. So I'm going to drop that off into rows right here, rows, and I get that. And I would want to find out the number of people that fall in the salary bracket. We're going to figure out that how do we create that ranges in a while, but let's just drop the people first. So employee name into values, because this is a text field, this is going to give me the count of the number of employees. Now I don't want to see that by individual salary figure how many people are on that salary number, but I'd like to see that what, range by range. So I'm going to again group this data field by, let's say, it's on 50,000. This is the start point, the maximum that your pivot table has found up in the data, and I'm going to group this by, let's say, 200,000, right? So okay, right? So you can see that it has automatically created a frequency table for your data, right? So, and you see that 151 people out of 201 people are working in a lower salary bracket, right? And very few people, about 50 of people, work in a very high salary bracket, right? So not evenly distributed, right? So this is what our salary distribution analysis is. Alright, so that was part 2 of the pivot table course. Now I'd just like to do a quick revision before we end the part 2. So in part 2, what we did was we first did that what is there in the analyze and the design tab. We just went over quickly through all the options that we have, and we're going to use a lot of these options in the coming video. and we also did some design tab options, banded rows and grand totals and stuff like that. And the other thing that we did was that how do we refresh the pivot table. A couple of options that we discussed. The first one was that how do you do it through a shortcut, which is Alt F5 and Control Alt F5 for refreshing all the pivot tables. We also did the macro way, right? So if you just go over to the developer tab and go over to Visual Basic, we have the macros right here, right? You can copy the macros and you can paste it into your own pivot tables, right? So I'm going to close that. And we also did that how can we group the data into the years and into the quarters, right? And we also did the Indian quarter problem, right? This is the Indian quarter problem, that how do you find an Indian quarter, right? And we then did a distribution table as well, right? So stay tuned to part number 3. In part number 3, I'm going to come back with a whole lot of calculations that are available to you in pivot tables. And finally, in part number 4, we're going to make a live case, like a dashboard that we can create out of a pivot table using simple and easy formulas, right? So stay with me, and we're going to catch up in the next part. Thank you and take care.